The private dining room at Hargrove's in the West Loop had a way of making you feel small even before you walked through the door. Nadia Osei had learned that within her first week. Not from the manager, not from the training manual, from the way the room itself settled into silence, the moment the heavy mahogany doors closed behind you. Like the air had been conditioned to behave, like noise was a thing that happened to other people in other parts of the city, and this room simply had no use for it. She adjusted the fold of the linen napkin draped over her forearm and checked the water glasses for the third time. Not because they needed checking, because it gave her hand something to do, while her mind did what it always did in the 15 minutes before a private booking, run through everything that could go wrong. Tonight's reservation was under Castellano Group. 6 guests. One of them, according to the booking notes, was flying in from overseas. The kitchen had been informed. The sommelier had pulled 3 bottles of a German Riesling that cost more than Nadia's monthly rent. Everything was in order. What the booking notes had not mentioned, what nobody had thought to mention, apparently, was that the overseas guest did not speak English. Nadia noticed it before anyone else did. She was pouring the first round of still water when the woman walked in, and she clocked it immediately. The slight hesitation at the door, the way the woman's eyes moved across the room, with the careful, calibrated attention of someone processing an environment in a language they don't fully understand. Not nervousness. Something quieter than that, the practiced composure of a person who had spent decades being the only one in the room who knew something no one else knew she knew. Her name, Nadia would learn later, was Dr. Una Park. 61 years old, founder of a biotech firm headquartered in Seoul that had quietly become one of the 3 most important pharmaceutical manufacturers in Asia. She wore a charcoal suit that had probably been made for her specifically, and she carried a slim leather portfolio that she set on the table in front of her with the kind of deliberateness that meant she was not here to make friends. The 2 men who had arranged the dinner were already seated when she arrived. When? Marcus Bellard stood up too quickly when Dr. Park entered, knocking his water glass with his elbow and catching it with a loud, graceless grab. He was the senior partner at Bellard Consulting, a firm that specialized in brokering acquisition deals between American companies and foreign investors, and he had the specific confidence of a man who had made a great deal of money doing something that most people didn't fully understand and therefore couldn't question. He smiled at Dr. Park with all of his teeth. Beside him, Derek Holt remained seated for a half-second longer than politeness required before he stood. He was Bellard's associate, younger, quieter, the kind of man who took notes on a legal pad with a mechanical pencil and never looked directly at you unless he needed something. He'd been in the industry long enough to understand that the person who controls the paperwork controls the outcome, and he had spent the past 6 weeks making sure that the paperwork for tonight was exactly what Marcus needed it to be. Their guests on the other side of the table were 2 representatives from Morrow Pharmaceuticals, the American company that Bellard Group was hoping Dr. Park's firm would acquire, or more precisely, invest heavily into. The deal, if it closed, would inject $42 million into Morrow's operations and give Bellard's firm a commission that Derek had already spent 3 times over in his imagination. The other 2 seats were occupied by associates of Dr. Park's, both Korean, both fluent in English, both carrying the particular kind of quiet alertness that comes from working closely with someone brilliant for a very long time. Dr. Park greeted Marcus with a nod and took her seat. Marcus began speaking, and Nadia, standing at the sideboard refilling the bread basket, realized within 30 seconds, 1-word seconds, that Dr. Park understood perhaps 1 word in 10. It wasn't obvious. That was the thing that struck Nadia most. Dr. Park didn't look confused. She didn't furrow her brow or lean toward her associates to whisper for clarification. She simply listened with the same composed, measured expression she might have worn while reviewing a spreadsheet. She nodded at appropriate intervals. She picked up her water glass when Marcus paused for effect. She was, Nadia thought, extraordinarily good at appearing to understand things she did not. But Nadia had grown up watching her grandmother do exactly the same thing in the waiting rooms of American hospitals, and she knew what it looked like. The small delay between hearing and responding. The way the eyes didn't quite track the speaker's face, the way they would if the words were landing. The economy of expression that comes from knowing that any reaction you show might be a reaction to the wrong thing. Dr. Park's two associates spoke to her in Korean occasionally, in brief murmurs, and Dr. Park would respond with a short phrase or a single word. But whatever they were translating for her, it wasn't everything. The conversation at the table moved too fast, jumped too easily between topics, and the associates, Nadia noticed, had begun to look slightly strained, like people trying to keep up with two conversations at once. Marcus Bellard had noticed none of this. He was the kind of man who mistook attentiveness for comprehension and silence for agreement. And Dr. Park was giving him both. The critical piece, Marcus was saying, settling back into his chair with the ease of a man delivering a speech he'd given many times, is that the licensing structure puts Morrow in the driver's seat on domestic distribution. Which is what makes this such a clean opportunity for your firm. You get the market exposure without the operational headache. One of Dr. Park's associates translated this, in condensed form, into Korean. Dr. Park said something brief in response. The associate said in English, Dr. Park appreciates the overview. Marcus smiled. Great, great. So I think what we want to do tonight is get aligned on the main terms, and then our team can have the formal documents ready by Thursday. Nadia set the bread basket on the table without a sound and stepped back to the sideboard. Derek Holt was watching Dr. Park's associates with an expression Nadia couldn't quite name. Not suspicion. Calculation, maybe. Like a man watching a clock and deciding whether he had enough time. The appetizers came out at 7:45. Nadia coordinated the plates with the kitchen runner, a young man named Theo, who had a habit of setting things down too hard on the marble table, and she spent the next several minutes doing quiet damage control, adjusting, recentering, making sure the presentation was what it needed to be. She moved through the room the way she always did, as close to invisible as a person can be, while still being present. This was something she'd gotten good at, not because she was naturally unobtrusive, but because she'd trained herself to be, because invisible was safe. Invisible meant she got to keep the job, and keeping the job meant the payments on her mother's treatment kept going through. Her mother, Grace, had been diagnosed with early-stage kidney disease 2 years ago. The diagnosis had come 3 weeks after Nadia had accepted a full scholarship to complete a master's program in international business at Northwestern. She had deferred once, then again. Then she had stopped deferring and started working. Hargrove's paid well by restaurant standards. The private dining room paid even better. Nadia had done the math 100 times, and it always came out the same. She needed this job more than she needed to be seen. She was at the sideboard, making a notation in the service log, when she heard Derek Holt's voice drop. It was a small shift, the kind you'd only notice if you were paying attention to the wrong things, which Nadia always was. He leaned slightly toward Marcus and said, quietly enough that it was meant to be private, the indemnification clause. Page 11. She's not going to catch it. Marcus said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile. Nadia kept her eyes on the service log, Her Korean was not fluent. She wanted Tidlund to be clear about that, at least to herself. She wasn't fluent. She had spent 8 months studying abroad in Seoul during her undergraduate years, lived with a host family, in Mapo taken language classes 5 days a week, and absorbed the rest of it through sheer immersive necessity. When she came back to Chicago, she'd kept up with it casually, the way you do with something you love but can't prioritize. She could hold a conversation. She could read a menu, a sound. She could understand most of what was said to her if it wasn't too fast and didn't involve technical jargon. What she could understand without any ambiguity was the word for trap, because one of Dr. Park's associates had just said it very quietly to the other while looking at the leather portfolio Dr. Park had placed on the table. The main course arrived at 8:30. Nadia moved through the service with her full attention divided in a way that was becoming physically uncomfortable. The plates were beautiful. She registered that distantly, the way you register something lovely when your mind is somewhere else. Seared duck breast with a cherry reduction, roasted fingerling potatoes with herbs from the kitchen garden. The sommelier came in to pour, and she stepped aside for him and then stepped back into position. The conversation at the table had shifted. Marcus was now walking Dr. Park's associates through a condensed version of what he called the main terms, which was clearly not the same as the full document. He spoke in the smooth, unhurried rhythm of a man making something complicated sound simple, and the associates translated in fragments, and Dr. Park listened and asked a question in Korean that one of the associates relayed as, "Dr. Park would like to confirm the timeline for the first distribution review." Marcus answered. The associate translated. Dr. Park nodded. What nobody at the table appeared to notice was that Marcus had just referred to the timeline in a way that was inconsistent with what he'd said during the appetizer course. Nadia had noticed because she had been listening, not obviously, not intrusively, but with the quiet, continuous attention she applied to everything in this room. The first mention had been 12 months. This mention was 18. She picked up the water pitcher and moved to Dr. Park's end of the table. As she refilled the glass, Dr. Park's associate shifted in her seat, and the leather portfolio slipped slightly, and for one moment the top page of the document inside was visible. Nadia's eyes moved across of it in the same reflexive way they moved across everything in this room, fast, cataloguing without meaning to. She saw the header. She saw the clause number. She saw 3 lines of English that took approximately 2 seconds to understand and approximately 2 more seconds to wish she hadn't. The indemnification clause on page 11, the one Derek Holt had said Dr. Park wouldn't catch, released Morrow Pharmaceuticals from any liability related to intellectual property disputes arising from existing patents, which meant that if any of Morrow's current drug formulations were later found to overlap with patents held by Dr. Park's firm, which they very possibly could be, given that Morrow had been aggressively expanding into the same therapeutic categories, Dr. Park's company would have no legal recourse. $42 million in, and the door would be locked behind her. Nadia set the water pitcher down on the sideboard. Her hands were steady. She was a little surprised by that. She looked at the room. Marcus, charming and oblivious to his own cruelty, Derek, watching the associates with that small calculating expression. Dr. Park, eating her duck breast with the composure of a woman who had built something real from nothing and was about to be separated from a significant portion of it because she'd trusted a translator to catch everything. Nadia thought about her grandmother in those hospital waiting rooms. The forms she'd signed without understanding. The things that had been explained to her in language she could follow but not fully pass. The way a person can be reasonable and careful, and still get taken apart by the fine print. She thought about page 11. She thought about the fact that she was a waitress and that what she was considering doing was the kind of thing that ends employment. Immediately. Publicly. Without the kind of reference letter that keeps the next job from being worse than this one. She thought about her mother's next payment, which was due on the 14th. She refilled the last glass at the table, stepped back to the sideboard, and stood there for 11 seconds. Then she walked to Dr. Park's end of the table, bent slightly, and said, in Korean, quietly enough that only Dr. Park and her nearer associate could hear, "Forgive me for interrupting. I'm a member of the service staff. I happened to see the document on the table, and I speak some Korean. I think there may be something in the contract that you should have explained to you directly, before you sign anything. I could be wrong, but I wanted you to know." Dr. Park looked at her. It was a long look, the kind that takes a person's full measure without moving. Then Dr. Park said in Korean, "What did you see?" The next 4 minutes were the quietest 4 minutes Nadia had ever spent in a room full of people talking. She described what she'd read in the same careful, measured way she'd have used to explain anything. The clause number, the language, the implication. She did not editorialize. She did not tell Dr. Park what to think. She said in Korean that she hoped was accurate enough, that she was not a lawyer, that she could be misunderstanding the context, but that the words she had seen appeared to waive the right to pursue IP-related claims. Dr. Park's associate, the one closer to her, translated for the other, and both of them went very still. Dr. Park looked at the portfolio. She opened it. She turned to page 11. Marcus Bellard registered the shift in energy, the way people register a change in weather, a moment after it had already changed. He looked at Dr. Park, and then at her associates, and then at the open document, and something moved behind his eyes that was too fast and too controlled to name. "Everything okay?" he said. Dr. Park looked up from the document. She looked at Marcus with the same composed expression she'd worn all evening. Then she said something in Korean. Her associate said, in English, "Doctor, Park would like her legal team to review the contract before any further discussion takes place." Marcus laughed. It was a perfectly calibrated laugh. Easy, unbothered, the laugh of a man who has nothing to worry about. Of course, of course. We always encourage a full review. The document isn't going anywhere. "No," Dr. Park's associate said. "Tonight. She would like them on the phone tonight, before dinner concludes." The laugh didn't disappear. It just became slightly architectural. Derek had not moved. He was looking at Nadia with an expression she had never seen on a human face before, the specific, precise expression of a man who had done something careful and clever and was watching it come apart. It wasn't rage. It was something colder and more concentrated than that. "You," he said. His voice was very controlled. "You're the waitress." Nadia met his eyes. "Yes, you don't work here anymore," Marcus said. His voice had changed entirely. The warmth had been subtracted from it the way you'd remove a cost from a budget. Cleanly, without ceremony. "Get your things and speak to the manager on the way out." Nadia nodded once. She set the linen napkin from her forearm on the sideboard. She looked at Dr. Park. Not for permission, not for rescue, just because the room required it. And Dr. Park was already looking at her with an expression that Nadia couldn't categorize as any of the things she'd expected. Not pity, not gratitude. Something more like recognition. Nadia walked out. The manager, a thin man named Paul, who had always treated Nadia with the kind of professional scrupulousness that communicates very little warmth and a great deal of respect, was waiting near the service corridor when she came through the door. Someone had clearly gotten to him first. "I'm sorry," he said, and he looked it. "The Castellano group has requested—" "I know," Nadia said. "It's fine." She went to the back, changed out of her uniform, put her personal items into her bag. Her hands were still steady. She found that interesting, not admirable, just interesting, like observing a fact about someone else. She texted her roommate that she'd be home early. She didn't explain. She put on her coat. She was buttoning it at the back entrance when one of Dr. Park's associates came through the corridor door, slightly breathless, in the manner of someone who had been walking quickly and was trying not to look like it. "Ms. Osei," the associate said, and Nadia registered, somewhere beneath the numbness, that the woman knew her name. She must have asked Paul. "Dr. Park would like to speak with you before you leave, if you're willing." Nadia stood there in the cold concrete of the service corridor and thought about it for a real, actual moment. Not automatically, not because she had any particular expectation of what it would mean. Then she said, "Okay." The private dining room was different now. The temperature of it had changed. Marcus and Derek were gone. She didn't know when they had left, only that their absence was the most present thing in the room. The two Morrow representatives sat at the far end of the table, looking like people who had been informed of a change of plans and had not yet decided how to feel about it. Dr. Park was standing by the window, not looking out. The curtains were still drawn, but standing near it, as if proximity to the outside air was its own kind of comfort. She turned when Nadia entered. They looked at each other. Then Dr. Park said something in Korean, and her associate translated. She says she has been in business for 31 years. In that time, she has encountered people who helped her because it benefited them. People who helped her because someone important was watching. And very occasionally, people who helped her when there was nothing in it for them, and significant cost if things went wrong. A pause. "She says she would like to know which category you believe you fall into." Nadia thought about it. Honestly, the way the question deserved. "I'm not sure," she said. "I think I did it because I've watched someone I've loved get lost in language she couldn't fully follow, and I knew what it looked like, and I didn't want to watch it happen again when I could do something about it." The associate translated. Dr. Park listened. Something in her expression shifted, but not dramatically, not into warmth exactly, as if something had just dralved, as something resolved itself. She spoke again. "Dr. Park asks if you are currently employed." Nadia looked at her. "I was until about 15 minutes ago." A very small thing moved in Dr. Park's expression, not quite a smile, the architecture of one. "Dr. Park's firm has a Chicago office. They are in the process of building an American operations team. They need someone who can manage communications between Korean and American partners, someone who understands both the language and the business context. She would like to offer you a formal conversation about that role, if you are open to it." "Not a guarantee," the associate added carefully. "A conversation." Nadia stood in the middle of the room that had just ended her job and looked at the woman who was offering her a door she hadn't known existed. "Yes," she said. "I'm open to that." The legal call happened. Nadia was not in the room for it. And she waited in the corridor with a cup of coffee that someone from the kitchen brought her without being asked, which she thought was kind, but she heard enough through the half-inch gap under the door to understand that the indemnification clause was, in fact, exactly what she had thought it was. Dr. Park's attorneys in Seoul reached at 7 in the morning their time, confirmed it in under 4 minutes. The deal was suspended pending a full document review. The Bellad Group's involvement was, according to one phrase she caught through the door, being reconsidered. Morrow Pharmaceuticals representatives, she heard, had not been fully aware of the clause either, or at least that was what they said. She didn't know what would happen after tonight. She knew that Marcus Bellard would call someone, probably tonight, and that something would be done about it, probably through lawyers, and that the shape of the outcome would depend on things she had no visibility into. What she knew, sitting in the service corridor with her coat on and her bag at her feet, was this: she had read 3 lines of a contract and said something about them. She had known what it might cost her, and she had said something anyway. And whatever came next, whatever the conversation with Dr. Park's team turned into, or didn't turn into, that part had already happened. Nobody could take it back. The kitchen was quiet now. The dinner service was winding down. Through the corridor wall, she could hear the distant percussion of a professional kitchen at the end of its night. The clatter of sheet pans, the spray of the dish station, the low voices of people who had been on their feet for 9 hours and were nearly done. She had worked in rooms like that for 2 years. She knew every sound. She finished her coffee. She knew. 3 weeks later, Nadia sat across a table from 2 members of Dr. Park's Chicago team in a glass-walled conference room in River North and answered questions for 2.5 hours about her educational background, her language skills, her professional experience, and what she would do in a series of increasingly specific hypothetical scenarios involving cross-cultural business negotiations. She answered in English. She answered 2 of the hypotheticals in Korean, haltingly, with the specific and accurate qualifier that her Korean was conversational and not technical, and that she would want to formalize her proficiency if the role required it. The woman running the interview, Director of Operations, Chicago, a Korean-American woman about 15 years older than Nadia, named Jin, made a note and said she appreciated the honesty. 2 days after that, Nadia got a call. The role was real. The title was Associate Liaison, American Operations. The salary was more than she had made in the previous 2 years combined. There was a language development budget. There were benefits. There was, Jin had mentioned, a lot of work. The Chicago office was new and the team was small, and the hours would not always be reasonable. Nadia accepted while standing in the kitchen of her apartment, still in the t-shirt she'd slept in, watching the morning come through the window over the sink. She called her mother after. Grace was in the middle of her Tuesday morning physical therapy session, so it went to voicemail, and Nadia stood in the kitchen and left a message that was longer than she intended. Not because she had planned to say everything she said, but because once she started, she found she had more to say than she'd realized. About the restaurant. About the woman in the charcoal suit who had looked at her in the corridor like a person being fully seen. About page 11 of a document that nobody was supposed to notice. About what it felt like to do the right thing and lose something because of it, and then find out that loss is not always the end of the sentence. She hung up and stood in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. Then she went to get ready for the first day of the rest of what her life was going to be.